Right, and we'll be going live any minute. It's just about 8 o'clock. I'll give people just another few seconds to log in and then we will make a start. So welcome to those of you who've already arrived. We'll just give people a few more minutes, or well, a few more seconds. I won't keep you waiting too long. They can always catch up later if they miss things, but we'll just give them a moment or two to log in, and then we'll crack on with tonight's live webinar. Free event, a relief to the football, I think, for some people. And we'll be looking at why it is that motorcycles continue to fall over, what it is about motorcycling that we know about crashing. Right, so it's just ticked over to 8 p.m. So let's get moving on tonight's event then. Right, so welcome along. Now, this is a free live webinar, so everybody who turns up, very nice to see you, and anybody who arrives on catch up, also fantastic that you managed to find time to look in. We have Krunislav, we have Enduro NW, I think, and Christine all looking in, plus a couple of other people who haven't announced themselves. So that's not too bad. Hopefully we'll get a few more in before the end of the evening. Now, the title of this particular free webinar is about understanding motorcycle crashes. Basically, what I wanted to talk about today is why it is that crashes involving motorcyclists are actually so predictable. So let's make a start then. Well, a little bit of history from a couple of years ago. I'm a member of a bike forum. There are one or two left, and just a day or so before I was booked to give my crash course in avoiding crashing talk to an advanced riding group, a regular on the forum proudly reported that his son was now the owner of an A2 intermediate license. Now, if you remember your licensing structure correctly, you'll know that in the UK and in Europe, you can get the intermediate A2 license from the age of 21. There is a way of getting it a little bit earlier, but most people wait till they're 21. And then you can ride a bike up to about 35 kilowatt. Now, as this lad had been riding and racing apparently since he was 5, Dad was not surprised that Laddo, as he called him, had only needed a very short course in order to pass first time. In fact, he was very proud of just how little training his son actually had to take. So just a few days later, it happened to be June the 1st actually, so almost this time of year, his shiny new KTM RC 390 was delivered to his door. On June the 2nd, less than 24 hours later, Laddo bounced the one-day-old bike off a car that was pulling out from his left. And this really is what is putting what I'm going to be talking about over the next 35 minutes or so into context. So what happened? Well, basically, it was yet another example of the UK's favourite motorcycle accident, the good old sorry mate, I didn't see you, Smidsy. Now, as far as I was able to glean from the posts, the circumstances were these: busy area, lots of traffic, near a school, sight lines blocked by parked vehicles, including buses, rider travelling at no more than 30 miles per hour, which presumably was the speed limit. And he hit an SUV, presumably a glancing blow rather than a full-on side impact, because the damage to bike and rider were minimal. Now, Dad was actually on the scene within minutes, which suggests it was actually very local and therefore probably an area that Laddo already knew. And he pronounced, "I don't think there was anything he could have done. I'd probably have hit it as well." And then various other people chimed in with their opinions on the incident. quotations taken directly from the posts, including "Glad he's okay, a valuable lesson in everyone is trying to get you. I think when a car pulls out, there's not a lot you can do. It's another case of expletive deleted driving. It was just this scenario that took me out. Absolutely nothing I could do to avoid it. Get back on the horse, live and learn." Now, I have to admit, I read those responses with a sinking heart. Also depressing about them, really, is the general theme that there was nothing he could have done about the collision, with at least one rider there having already experienced much the same crash and having concluded in the same circumstances that the same thing would likely happen again. So, what about live and learn? Well, the problem is, of course, to live, first you have to have an experience and survive it. Now, let's give you a little bit of potted history about me for those who don't know my background. Now, I spent nearly all my post-year university years. Start that again. I spent nearly all my post-university years working full-time as a courier for 16 years on the trot. Now, I learned a lot about keeping myself out of trouble in those years on a mix of city streets, city centre being London, of course, and rural roads and lanes and motorways all over the south of the UK, basically. And then I switched to attempting to make motorcycling safer for riders. Now, my first experience of this was a slightly odd one. I got involved with a university bike group. I wasn't at the university. It was fairly long time after I'd left university myself. It was the early 1990s. Now, what happened was a biking lecturer had realized that there were students in the bike club who were very, very, very inexperienced riders. Now, not surprisingly, when you think about the average age of a student. And they were having crashes, which was sometimes keeping them away from college. Now, she realized that while she was more experienced, she wasn't actually an expert rider herself. So the word got passed out to that she was looking for anyone with the time and inclination who happened to be an experienced motorcyclist to help out by mentoring the club. Now, as it happened, a buddy of mine called Andy just happened to be doing an agriculture course at the college, and he got roped in, and he in turn contacted me to see if I was interested in doing some helping out. Now, at that point, I was still working as a courier, but I'd already started to think about a shift of career. And in fact, I was in contact at this point with an international group of riders and instructors via the old CompuServe hub, which you accessed via dial-up internet, if you remember that dreadful experience. Anyway, I got involved, went along. Andy and I got to meet the guys and the gals in the group. There was about a dozen of them. We sat and talked bikes over a coffee. We took them out on group rides. And one of the things I did was I dug out one of my very treasured possessions, an excellent series called Survival Arts that had been published in a magazine called Motorcycle Sport and Leisure some years earlier. And I got them photocopied and distributed. And between us, we coached a couple of the students through their bike tests too. Now, that lasted a couple of years before the club kind of fizzled out. But anyway, to cut a long story short, it got me on the path to becoming a motorcycle instructor. And by 1995, I'd switched careers and I had become a basic trainer. Now, it was at that point that I began to think, hang on a minute, there's a problem with what I'm required to teach learners. Now, as part of our, I'll use the term indoctrination because that's pretty much what it was, into the Driving Standards Agency methods and now the Driving and Vehicle Standards Agency, but it was the DVA back then. We were supposed to tell everyone that CBT had reduced crashes and casualties amongst riders. I wasn't convinced. So, this being 1995, the internet was just starting to get going seriously. And one of the things that I immediately did was went onto it and I started to find out whatever I could about motorcycle crashes. And I also began to investigate the background to motorcycle training in the UK. So, if you are a more recent rider, you may be surprised to discover that the interventions aimed at power two-wheeler riders have had a very long history in the UK indeed. So the motorcycle test for motorcyclists, basically in the UK, was introduced on the 1st of June 1935, and that matched the test introduced some years earlier for car drivers. Now, allowing for the 6-year interruption caused by World War II, it really wasn't very long before there was an interest in upskilling motorcyclists. And when I was looking back into the history of rider training, I was surprised to discover that the Royal Automobile Club, the RAC, had actually been connected with motorcycle training as far back as 1947, although I haven't actually been able to dig up any details of just how widespread that particular scheme was and how it was conducted. But certainly by the early 1950s, the joint RAC-ACU scheme was in operation, and here's a badge, a picture I found of a rather nice metal and enamel badge telling you that somebody is an instructor. Now, this was a tie-up between the RAC, the motoring organisation, who also accept motorcyclists as members, by the way, and the Auto Cycle Union, and that is the governing body for motorcycle sport in the UK. So they oversee everything from sort of off-road trials and sort of motocross events right up to the British superbikes and things like that. This voluntary and volunteer-led scheme, it grew significantly during the mid-1970s, I discovered, because at that time there was funding going into the scheme from many local councils. And as it happens, when I started riding, which was all the way back in 1975, the RAC-ACU scheme for new riders was in fact the only way to get some tuition. It involved 24 hours of instruction. It was spread over 12 weeks. It often ran on weekday evenings. Unfortunately, my local scheme operated on Sunday mornings when I just happened to be playing cricket, of course, during all the fair days and evenings that there were during the summer. So was the RAC-ACU scheme any good? Well, a study called the Scoping Study on Motorcycle Training, which was carried out in the very early 80s. It says, quote, during 1981, observations were carried out at 42 RAC-ACU training centres, and a report on the observations published. It was noted that the pupil-instructor ratios were good and that few errors escaped the notice of the instructors. Less favourably, the scheme's administration and record keeping and variations in the content and method of delivery of the programme came into some criticism. That was obviously a fairly in-depth look at the what was going on. 42 training centres investigated. So there's the RAC-ACU. What happened next? Well, after 30 years of this voluntary scheme, fresh government legislation introduced changes to the motorcycle test and promptly killed it off. So what happened? Well, the short answer is that, let's just turn that banner off, which is still going. It was the Part 1, Part 2 motorcycle test. Part 1, you may recall, was a short off-road handling test, not entirely dissimilar to the current Module 1 part of the bike test. And you could either take it at an HGV test site in front of a motorcycle examiner, or you could be signed off through the same exercises by a certified instructor in much the same way as you get your CBT certificate written up now. So the problem was that you first of all required an off-road site, and not too surprisingly, the RAC-ACU scheme, they said they couldn't afford the investment that would be required to find these sites. The second problem was that the instructors had now to be DSA certificated, and they decided they couldn't manage that either. So the RAC-ACU pulled their funding. Now, what happened next? Well, some of the training schemes went solo, and they created the first independent schools we have today. At the same time, there was their first attempt at a nationwide school. An organisation called Star Rider stepped in to fill the void with something they called the National Motorcycle Training Scheme. And also the BMF and ROSPA, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents, they announced plans to take up some of these disenfranchised training schemes. Now, rather belatedly, having realised that they'd actually just managed to kill off the existing 30-year-old voluntary scheme, all in the name of road safety, the government announced a fund of £100,000, pretty paltry sum really when you think about it, even then, to subsidise the new BMF ROSPA scheme. And what did they do with it? Well, they gave it all to ROSPA, and ROSPA are hardly an organisation that are short of funds, unlike the BMF. Not too surprisingly, the British Motorcyclists Federation did kick up a bit of a fuss. They eventually got an even more paltry £10,000 in a grant. Anyway, despite the cash, ROSPA soon pulled out, so leaving the BMF to develop the scheme alone. Now, they did a pretty good job, because at their peak, which was in the late 1980s, the BMF had at least 185 centres across the UK, which included a number of the former Star Rider centres, because they had been taken over when Star Rider's parent company went bust. Now, next development was 1989. The much better pursuit test. That's the one where the instructor, rather than standing on a street corner and running from street to street to try and catch you out as you come around the bend, is now behind you on a motorcycle, so you don't get any break from being under examination. And it did make the bike test much harder to pass. Also, in some ways, made it easier to pass, because you knew what you were going to have to do. Anyway, that was 1989. 1999, things got tougher still when compulsory basic training with its own DSA certified instructors was introduced. Unfortunately, the BMF scheme in turn didn't survive the need to get instructors certificated for the next stage of developments, and this was direct access. Although some sites tried to continue operating, I was actually investigating working at the BMF site as a paid instructor around 93, 94. The increasing rigour of the DSA check tests on instructors, plus the introduction of direct access, which meant the instructors had to be certificated up another tier. It basically finished the BMF off, with site after site losing their approved training body status, as the instructors basically failed to meet the required standards. So what happened next? Well, this left an opening for a company called CSM. If I can actually get the picture up, you'll see one of their badges. I'm just trying to find it. There it is. So let's get that up on screen. Why has that disappeared? Just find the screen again. There it is. And that should now be on screen. Good. So that was CSM, Chelmsford School of Motoring, if I remember right. Now, they stepped into the breach. They took over a lot of the BMF's old sites, I think. And in just a few years, they went from a local school in one town in Essex to become the de facto national training school. The school operated as a charitable trust. That allowed them to avoid charging VAT, which gave them a financial benefit over many of their competition. And I believe they topped 100 franchised sites at one point from the south of England to Scotland. But CSM had their own problems, and they in turn did not survive the introduction of the direct access scheme, with the training on big bikes in 1997, specifically the 2-to-1 ratio at which direct access had to run had a big impact, because prior to that they had run their 125 training at a ratio of 5, even higher number of trainees to one instructor. I know that because I worked for them for a few months, and the most I had out on the run was 7, no less. Now my guess is also that the management were rather too greedy, probably took too much cash out of the business. Anyway, citing reduced profits, they folded around 2000. I can't remember the exact year, but I do remember they laid off their staff with a Christmas card, which clearly a nice touch. And that led us pretty much to the current situation, which is a mix of independent schools and small regional outfits with, a half a dozen sites or something, but there's nothing national. Now, the test itself, what's changed here? It hasn't stood still. The theory test came in, the hazard perception test was then added, and then the new EU licensing laws required the off-road manoeuvres, which make up module 1 of the current two-part test, where the second part is out on the road. That came in 2011, along with the complex system of stepped motorcycle licenses we have at the moment, where each stage has to be moved up to by taking exactly the same test. And of course, there are also numerous interventions aimed at riders who already hold a full motorcycle license. So that brings us pretty much up to date. So a reasonable question to ask is, does any of this work? Well, if we simply look at the headline casualty rates, and we can go back to the end of the Second World War and find those without too much difficulty, what we can see straight away is a number of riders killed and seriously injured peaked in the 1950s, very early 1950s. And since then, there has been a huge and fairly steady reduction in the number of fatalities and serious injury rates for riders to the current stage where we have around, very roughly, 350 fatalities and around 3,500 seriously injured motorcyclists each year. So what caused this drop in casualties since that peak back in the early 50s? Well, back then, the fact is that motorcycles were, of course, day-to-day transport for many people. And what has changed, of course, is that since the early 50s, certainly since the 1960s, cars have become affordable, and more people have bought a car and switched away from using a motorbike as daily transport. And when you look at the drop in the KSI rate, it pretty much matches the registration numbers of motorcyclists. One of the interesting observations that I made when looking at an almost but not quite complete list of KSI figures that I cobbled together from various data sources a few years ago was that the big dips in the fatality rates did not match up with training. One big dip matched the helmet law, which probably wasn't because people stopped killing themselves by not wearing a helmet, but people stopped riding motorcycles because they had to wear a helmet. Another dip followed the introduction of the old Part 1, Part 2 test. That came in, I remember, in the early 80s. But again, if you look at the stats, the KSI data much more immediately followed the slump in motorcycle registrations that followed the two-part test and the restriction on to a 125 incidentally at the same time. Now, CBT, dating from 1990, remember, I couldn't find any obvious results in terms of a dip in the KSI rates, and I can't see any research that has produced such a link either. So I do think the DSA were clutching at straws a bit when they told us to tell students that what they were about to learn would be capable of reducing their risk of a crash. And it doesn't seem that the latest split test or tiered license system has had any positive effect either. If anything, the latest figures appear to show that motorcycle casualties have actually leveled off. We haven't had the steady but small continual decline in injuries and fatalities that we'd seen from the about the early 80s through to about 2010. And it's not just me observing that too. There have been research studies which I have talked about in my Facebook page that have basically shown that training doesn't appear to have any long-term benefits. There may be some short-term benefits, but long-term the effect seems to wear off. So where did the reduction in casualty figures actually come from then? Well, my guess is at least some of it is technological improvement. Bikes handle significantly better than they did when I got into biking. Tyres have seen a quantum leap forward. Brakes, for example, now work in the rain. And most recently, of course, we have ABS, which helps keep riders who would otherwise have crashed upright when they lock a wheel. We've also seen far better and more consistent use of protective clothing. The sort of there've been debates about the effectiveness of nylon jackets and things, but they are undoubtedly better than waxed cotton, in my opinion. Body armor is fitted too. Much of it may not be all that high quality. A lot of the older stuff didn't meet standards, but even if it doesn't prevent broken bones, and that's certainly the conclusion of one Australian study, it does certainly prevent skin abrasion injuries, which would have taken people off to hospital. And we shouldn't overlook significant improvements in helmet design either, particularly helmet retention in crashes. That was a real concern, I remember, back in the late 70s and early 80s when um, what's his name? Professor Roderick Woods at Cambridge University did a study on helmets. They actually found that a lot just simply came off when you crashed. So it's likely, put that all together, that many previously fatal crashes are now survivable, maybe with serious injuries, but at least you've survived. And that many previously serious injury crashes now only result in minor injuries. And of course, likelihood is that some of the minor injury crashes will actually walk away from. But as I said, the point to note is that those improvements seem to have plateaued since about 2011, 2012, and I suspect that has not something to do with the rather crazy take a test on a 125, get a license for a 125 law that the EU brought in. So it means basically hardly any young riders ever bother to take anything more than CBT. And during their first few years on bike, there's simply no point. And the second thing I would say is that CBT is no longer fit for purpose. It's over 40 years since it was first introduced. And the third area of concern is obviously the delivery riders, the explosion of number of delivery riders all hurtling around on L plates. But let's look beyond the numbers. Let's look at crash types. Now, when we take a look at the motorcycle crash statistics, one thing that's very obvious is that in the 8 decades since the end of the Second World War, if crash numbers are down, what's not changed is the type of crashes that motorcyclists are involved in. Nothing much there has changed at all. So we only need a quick look at the stats to see that riders are at risk from the same few basic crash types as they always have been. When things go wrong, we're not likely to be struck by lightning. We're not likely to have a portable toilet falling off in front of us from a truck, or we're not likely to topple into a black pit that suddenly opened up in front of us. These sort of bizarre crashes may make the headlines, but they actually make up a very tiny proportion of the total. And the three standard crash types identified are junction collisions, usually right-of-way violations, ROWV for short. They involve a motorcycle and another vehicle, usually a car, where the driver usually commits a looked but failed to see error. That's got its own LBFTS abbreviation. It's so common. And the collision that results when the biker rides into the car is also so common that it has its own name. It's the "sorry mate, I didn't see you, Smithy." There are cornering crashes. Now these are usually a loss of control by the rider, which results in running wide, either off the road on the right-hander or into oncoming traffic on the left-hander. Now remember, if you're watching from abroad, this is the UK, so we ride on the left. And the third standard crash is the overtaking incident. There are multiple ways overtakes go wrong, and I won't go into detail on those. But just how many crashes do these three scenarios cause out of the total? Well, according to a UK Department for Transport report from 2004, so 20 years ago now, that took data from police forces in the West Midlands, quote, the majority, 70% plus, of motorcycle accidents are covered by the scenarios outlined. So junctions, corners, overtakes, and nothing much has changed with the latest data. Something between 1 in 3 and 1 in 4 of all crashes involve incidents at junctions, and this is actually why I focused on the Smithy crash and created the Science of Being Seen project. And around 15% of crashes, that's about 1 in 7, they happen on bends, and the vast majority of these are rider error. So I'll go further I'll say that when we do crash, we're still being caught out by those self-same situations that caught our grandparents out in the early 1950s. It was probably great-grandparents, actually. Drill back through the data, look at the years covered by the RACACU scheme, the 50s and 60s, the BMF training scheme of the 70s, Star Rider of the 80s, the compulsory training of the 90s, direct access, off-road module 1, on-road module 2, etc. And the answer is the same. What's the most common crash of the lot? And it is, of course, the Smidsey collision. Now, then the question then is, why do we keep having the same crashes? Now, first up, I would say that the idea that riding is safe when done right, as I was told by an advanced examiner many years ago, I'd say that statement is badly flawed because it's based on a total misunderstanding of the risk factors. There are some very well-known risk factors. So what we tend to do is we look for the high risk riders, those riders who exhibit the kind of behavior that makes them somewhat more likely to crash than the sort of ordinary rider riding along next to them. And when we do that, what do we find? Well, we find that novice riders, like the lad on his one-day-old KTM, they are significantly overrepresented in crash stats. So coming back to training, that doesn't really say much about the effectiveness of what he was taught. And it certainly doesn't say much about the motorcycle hazard perception test, as he got taken up by the most common crash of all on his very first day. So I say the problem is that we simply don't teach new riders, or new drivers come to that, about why things like this happen. So they go out on the road in their nice new shiny bike and they bounce off a car on day 2. It's not the rider's fault for failing to use their imagination when it's a situation that their training's not prepared them for. So, what about the hazard perception test? Because surely that would be something that would help sort these problems out. Now, the TRL document said, quote, the introduction of the UK's hazard perception test as part of the driving theory test was credited with reducing collisions in new drivers by around 11%, presumably through increasing the abilities of novice drivers in this critical skill. Now, I'll be frank, I've never been particularly happy with that particular study. Not least because it uses the word presume. In other words, it doesn't actually know. And secondly, because whilst an improvement of 11% is good in terms of road safety, when you put it into the overall population, if you can drop collisions and crashes by 11%, you're doing pretty damn well. But what it's not good for is you or me, the individual. Because if you think about it, that just over 1 in 10 chance of avoiding a crash isn't a great improvement. What it means is that almost 9 out of 10 new drivers will still crash. So from the individual perspective, it's not wonderful. Now, the hazard perception test, I would say, is also flawed in other ways. First things first, it trains new drivers not to look for potential hazards. That is, things that could go wrong at some point in the future if a particular scenario plays itself out. It focuses on identifying what the DVSA call developing hazards. Now, the trouble is, these are ones which are on the cusp of going to the next step of becoming an actual hazard, where we actually have to take some emergency action to get out of trouble. So if we look at the picture down here, for example, that car is just at the giveaway line. Is it a potential hazard? Well, probably not. It's probably well, it's right on the cusp here. If at the moment it moves, it becomes a developing hazard, and that's when the DVSA want you to click on it. If it's sat there minding its own business, then you should skip it. That's my understanding of the theory test, anyway, the hazard perception test. But the trouble is that the moment it moves, the moment that you have to react to it is very short indeed. And it may be that, in fact, by the time we've recognised it, it's too late to get out of trouble. And of course, there's one other huge problem with the hazard perception test. When you actually do it, there's no lights out, game over moment when you get it all wrong. The ultimate threat never actually develops. What it shows you is that, in fact, everybody does stop. The car doesn't pull out. The bicycle doesn't swing into the road in front of you. Everything goes hunky-dory. So I don't particularly like the hazard perception test. I don't think it's particularly adequate test. But it's not just novices who are at high risk. Now, experienced riders on unfamiliar bikes, they are also prone to crash. I'm not going to go into great more detail on this, but just think about that next time you hire a bike or book a test ride. Now you'll probably realise why they take such huge damage waivers, or even if you simply take up your mate's offer to ride their bike. Not surprisingly, another high-risk group are those who exhibit bad behaviour. They may not bother to get a licence, or they ride around when banned, ride impaired, or habitually break rules, including speeding. And this is the group we probably hear about most, thanks to the sort of police takedown videos and the press releases after a successful conviction of a rider caught doing something daft. But you know what? The more I see of these sort of released to show the risk of extreme behaviour type videos, the less I think they actually achieve. I'm pretty certain that most of us would actually look at a clip like that and think, well, I certainly wouldn't ride like that. And then we fall into the mental trap of thinking, because I don't ride like that, I won't crash. So here's the bad news. For the rest of us, the fairly cozy observation that if we do everything right, we must be low risk is not unreasonable, because unfortunately, it's statistics that are largely doing the job of keeping us safe. If you think about it, those 350 fatalities, 3,500 serious injuries are actually distributed within a riding population of about 1.2 million riders, covering several billion miles each year. So on a purely personal level, your chances, my chances of a bad crash are actually pretty tiny in any one year. Now, road safety doesn't work on individual risks so much as the big numbers. So when you take the annual crash stats, you find that, in fact, the vast majority of motorcycle crashes aren't happening to the extreme riders, the novices. They're actually happening to ordinary riders doing everyday things they've probably done many times before, like negotiating junctions, going around roundabouts, making an overtake. So yes, our individual risk is reduced if we don't ride the bike like a twat, but we don't eliminate them completely. We're not safe because we're sensible and well behaved. We're mostly safe because of stats. And then, of course, most of the crashes that happen to the kind of rider you'd say, I never expected them to crash. So, okay, here's the bottom line. I can't see any evidence that training is achieving much in the way of reducing our risk from these standard accidents at junctions, in corners. This was a combination cornering and overtaking crash. They remain the same in the list of KSI causes that they always do. We've known about where these crashes happen for decades, but we know more than that. Research goes back to the 60s. That tells us how and why they happen. And the conclusion is that the rider could almost always have predicted the crash, and far more often than not, could actually have taken steps to get out of it too. So I can fairly confidently say training may have changed the way riders learn to ride, but it hasn't changed the way we crash. And that should lead us to a very uncomfortable question. If we've got 60 years of testing and training behind us, as well as all the better riding books, of course, just why are motorcycle riders from the UK crashing in the same places? It's not a question that gets asked very often, but there is, I think, an answer, and it lies with insight. My belief is we can use the predictable nature of the collisions that most cyclists are involved in order to develop strategies that can help keep them safer. Now, for a number of years, I've been saying this. Insight aims to increase awareness of what can go wrong and how to get out of trouble, rather than focus on giving riders more skills in the belief that they won't get into trouble, something that actually tends to engender overconfidence incidentally. And it's not just a random theory of mine, it's supported by the way safety conscious industries like airlines have been training their pilots for some years. Now, we already know where most crashes happen, and I'd probably add rear end shunts into the car in front and group rider spills to the standard junction cornering and overtaking crashes. But what's needed is not just this knowledge of where they happen. Remember what I said about the hazard perception test, that there's no lights out, game over moment. At the end, the ultimate collision never develops. And we need to see what happens when things do go wrong. Now, intriguingly, whilst researching this talk, I discovered that the TRL blog post I quoted earlier also talked about, quote, one remarkable course that uses nothing much more than interacting with videos on YouTube, unquote. I looked up the paper it referenced. It's titled 1,000 Years of Crash Experience in 3 Hours, an online hazard perception training course for drivers. I need to look at it in more detail, but the key conclusions were that the course incorporated evidence-based training methods and more than 100 real crash videos. Trainees' scores improved on a validated hazard perception and hazard prediction test. The course led to practical changes as well, safer vehicle following distances, based on a video-based test, and all trainees reported improvements in their on-road driving safety after the training course. Now, effectively, this defensive training needs these insights into what actually happens in a crash. It doesn't really matter whether the mistakes are our own or other riders. We have to see what goes wrong in order to have some confidence in the training that we're given in staying out of trouble. And of course, we also need to know what goes wrong when our options are limited by the emergency actually happening. Now, real defensive riding isn't just about riding slowly everywhere. It's about making proactive choices in order to change our response to changing situations. Although I will say that, though most cyclists don't like to hear this, slowing down when faced with a threat is a good idea. It gives us more time to assess, more time to think, and more time to do whatever our chosen response actually is. Those are the three essential elements of any riding system. So we have more time to perform. Is this a negative way of thinking? Is it a depressing way to ride? That's what somebody told me some years ago. I genuinely don't think so. What is depressing is watching the YouTube videos of here we go again as somebody crashes, or that's the third driver to crash into me this year. That was one video that I saw fairly recently. And the negative thinking is that it's always somebody else's fault and not the riders. The council didn't put up the bend warning sign, which is why they ran off the road, or the driver should have seen the bike coming, even though the biker had the option to see and avoid the car. So sort of bring things to a conclusion. The new rider crash I mentioned at the top of the show. Remember the dad who said that his son was riding at no more than 30 miles per hour. Well, I can't help but wonder if the rider had been a little bit more aware of what can go wrong, they would have been a little bit more cautious, just maybe gone a bit slower, and maybe the outcome would have been different. And it's my opinion that it's only when we really begin to understand the threats and risks, and we have a clear idea of what kind of action we need to take to stay out of trouble, that most likely actually becomes more fun. And that's because we're not suffering the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, to quote Shakespeare, but proactively taking arms against a sea of troubles. So that's the sort of piece of work that I've been putting out for years. I think I first ran those off these little mini business card things with some thinking about how to identify the Smidsy collision. That I must have done those 15 years ago. I have been handing them out. And maybe they've helped a few riders think about their approach to junctions. Right, okay. Who've we got? Nick's looked in, Blitzer's looked in. Nice to see you both. Mad Cockney's along too. A little bit late, he said. So that's pretty much it for the evening. I'm going to sum up now. 40 minutes or so of chit chat is plenty from me. I hope that you found something useful to take away from here. None of this is about blaming the motorcyclists for getting things wrong. It really is pointing the finger at the way that motorcyclists are developed as thinking road users. That's the area where I think rider training falls down. And I think it falls down right across the board, from basic training right through to advanced level 2. There are a few hints. I mentioned one on my my 11s, wasn't it, on Sunday, about a new ride hub that's suggesting that it's going to show riders ways of staying out of trouble. Only about 12 years after I presented those, started throwing those business cards out to people, the one I just showed you a moment ago. But we're getting there. And there is an Australian program I've also seen, which looks a much more proactive, intuitive sort of keep the rider out of trouble by giving them this insight into things that go wrong. So there you go. That's it for today. Thanks for looking in. There will be another one of these talks in a few days' time. I can't quite remember when it is. I forgot to make a note of it. If you have enjoyed this, it is a free talk. I very much appreciate you joining me. If you do want to support the channel, though, I'm always more than happy. You can go over to my Patreon page, which is Survival Skills 837, and you can make a small donation over there. Everything gratefully received. Or you can head to my coffee page, it's .com survival skills, and discover what I offer over there in the way of books and free downloads and a whole load else over there as well. And if you want some specific help on any item, don't forget you can also come over to my coffee page. The URL's just going across the bottom there, and you can order yourself a consultation or even a free online coaching session. So that's the advertising bit for the evening done. Please make sure that you like, share, subscribe to the channel, everything else you need to do. All helps the YouTube algorithm pass these videos out to other people. But very much indeed, I'm very pleased that you've looked in today, and I hope that I will see you again. 11s is coming up on Sunday as normal at 11 a.m. and there will be another one of these shows, these live free webcasts, in a week's time. As I say, I've forgotten what the date I chose was, but I'll let you know what that's happening in a day or two. Right, that's it from me. Thank you very much indeed. If you're enjoying the football, hope things go well for you, and if you're not enjoying the football, let's hope you enjoy the slightly better weather out there on the bike. Stay shiny side up.